All right. Good. Good for it. Okay. We left off, crew, with the Knights of Labor falling apart as a result of the Haymarket Square strike in Chicago. The fall and collapse of the Knights of Labor leads to the rise of some new labor unions. I'm going to talk about some of the ones that were strongest. So, the strongest skilled labor union of the era, which is still around today, but it's a little different, was formed in 1886 by this guy up here, Samuel Gompers, in the white. He founded the American Federation of Labor. Basically, what the AFL did was it took all of these skilled labor unions and brought them under a single umbrella. Okay, so it was a bit of a consolidation among different unions, but again, the focal point was skilled labor. What Gompers and the AFL demanded was a fair share for labor and also fair wages and better work conditions, as well as more opportunity. Okay? Gompers was a skilled cigar maker, and they actually had some pretty decent successes. They fought for better wages, they fought for better hours, improved safer work conditions. If you are wondering why we celebrate Labor Day in September, which we've talked about in the past, it happens because of the American Federation of Labor securing the National Labor Day in 1894. Remember, I always encourage you guys to reflect on Labor Day because we obviously have similarities and differences, but one common bond that we all have, we're all going to work. And we all need to remember that our most basic labor rights were hard-earned. The AFL was on decent, solid foundations, but they sold themselves short for a couple of reasons. Number one, they don't permit the entry of unskilled labor. Really, unskilled labor won't have another large-scale union force come together until the creation of the IWW, the International Workers of the World, which we'll talk about in the future as we head into World War I. They also, like the National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor that we talked about before, discriminated against African Americans and women. So this is going to prevent them from having larger numbers. Their critics often called them the Labor Trust because they only represented 3% of the American workforce. There's a lot that they were missing out on. From 1881 to 1900, there were over 23,000 strikes involving over 6 million workers in America, many of which were violent. The 4 strikes that I am going to highlight, I've already covered one, Haymarket Square in Chicago. I'm going to teach you about 3 more today. Those are the ones that you're responsible for. Technically, I've taught you about 5 of them. Come on in. All right. So, by 1900, the general public starts to concede that workers needed more rights. Also, you guys need to understand that there was an estimated loss of $450 million due to strikes, many of which turned violent. So even some business leaders are starting to realize, hey, maybe we should provide higher pay and better conditions so we'll lose less money. But there are some tycoons that are going to dig their heels in to try and prevent these workers from unionizing. Okay? One guy in particular, who's our car guy we learned about? Henry Ford. Very good. Ford is totally against unionization. And that's going to lead him to raising wages for workers and trying to lower hours to prevent his workers from unionizing. Another really famous union during this era that the AFL inspired is the American Railway Union, founded by this guy on the bottom here, Eugene V. Debs. Debs was from Indiana, was a fireman on the railroad. He's going to unionize rail workers. They're going to lead a pretty big strike called the Pullman Company Town strike that I'm going to talk about here momentarily. He's also going to be the face of the American Socialist Party. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And I'm going to expand on that when we get into World War I. Debs ran for president as a socialist 5 times. One of those times, he ran for president from jail. So we'll talk more about that as we move forward. I'm going to briefly explain these 3 violent labor uprisings. We talked about Haymarket Square, which occurred outside of the McCormick Reaper factory in May of 1886, that became violent. These were as violent and, in a couple of cases, more violent than Haymarket Square. So the Homestead strike, one of the Carnegie steel mills outside of Pittsburgh, was a company town. This strike started in late June of 1892. Carnegie was in Europe on vacation. One of his ruthless managers that was in America and in charge was a guy named Henry Clay Frick. Frick cut wages and wanted these workers to sign yellow dog oaths to promise that they would leave their union, known as the AA, the Amalgamated Association of Steelworkers. What pushed this over the edge is that one of the workers in the factory was killed on the job, which was pretty common. It's estimated that in this era from the 1870s to about 1910 or so, it's estimated that about 35,000 laborers died in the workforce annually. This guy dies, and what Frick does not realize is that these steelworkers had been planning for quite a while for a strike, and they've been stocking up weapons in preparation. The result is, guys, hang in here, please. Thank you. Frick is going to call in Pinkertons, which are private agents. When Pinkertons are brought in, things are going to usually get violent. So the Pinkertons are brought in. These steel workers go to war with the Pinkertons, and the end result, 16 people were killed, and there were numerous injuries. But this was a setback because it's a major defeat for the AA union, and it's also a setback for the full unionization of steelworkers. That is not going to happen until the heading into World War I, and it won't be strengthened until we head into World War II. The Pullman Company Town strike, this one occurred, another one outside of Chicago, another company town strike in Pullman, Illinois on May 11th, 1894, a couple years later. 3,000 employees of the Pullman Palace Car Company, this was company town owned by George Pullman, Palace Car Company tycoon, went on strike because Pullman cut wages by up to 35%. And he rose the rent and the cost of goods in the company town. So not only are they losing money, but they're paying more for goods and their basic services there. So this particular strike, led by Debs and members of the American Railway Union, is what is known as a wildcat strike. This means that the union did not give them official permission to strike. They just took it upon themselves to launch the strike, and it shut down train traffic all around Chicago. And if you shut down train traffic around Chicago, where's that going to shut train traffic down elsewhere? Pretty much everywhere. Well, President of the U.S. at the time, Grover Cleveland, he's got the ability to send in federal troops because they're interfering with the movement of U.S. mail. This has happened before. Rutherford B. Hayes did this in Martinsburg, West Virginia in 1866 during the Great Upheaval. 1876, my apologies. So with that being said, no, 1877, doesn't matter, summer of 1877. Regardless, soldiers move in and things get violent, and it's estimated that there were 30 deaths as a result of this. But the real big one, crew, is going to be the Battle of Blair Mountain in Logan County, West Virginia. This is where coal miners went to war with local police, Phelps Baldwin agents, which was a rival company of Pinkerton, members of the National Guard, and federal soldiers. It is estimated that 1 million rounds of ammunition were fired in this labor uprising. It is also estimated that hundreds were killed and thousands were wounded. This labor uprising in Logan County on Blair Mountain was similar to like what an actual battle that we would have seen in, like, say, the Civil War. So these are three of the most violent labor strikes at the turn of the 20th century. So on the left here we have a lithograph of the Homestead strike. On the right, lithograph of the Pullman strike. Questions up to this point? All right, cool. So, progressive era roots. At the turn of the 20th century, 1900, America had 76 million people, and the U.S. is heavily influenced by the progressive movement to fight against monopolies, corruption, inefficiency, and social injustice. This was a fight for consumer protection and labor rights. The purpose of the progressives was to use government as an agency of human welfare. Here are your key progressive presidents that we're going to talk more about in our next class: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. But the guy that really gets this ball rolling for the trust busting is going to be Teddy Roosevelt, who's a complicated character and figure in American history. We'll talk about those complications and controversies a bit later. The progressives' roots in the Granger farmer movement in the post-Civil War era, in the Greenback Labor Party movement of the post-Civil War and Reconstruction era, and of course the Populist Party movement of the 1890s. Government controlled by the people. Obviously, the people want these corrupt businesses to move away from limited liability, and they want to check special interests that controlled Congress in the era. Some of the early laws that were passed to break up the trusts: Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Acts. Sherman was passed during the presidency of Benjamin Harrison. The Clayton Antitrust Act was passed during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. And in between those two bookends, there's a whole lot of antitrust legislation passed, especially during the era of Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. Guaranteed economic opportunities through government regulation. Pure Food and Drug Act. This is something that we still live with to this day that is beneficial. the fact that you are going to open, how many of you guys have eaten prepackaged food in the last week? Pretty much everyone. Was anyone scared that they were going to die from it? They were not. Okay? Pure Food and Drug Act. The fact that you can take medication and not have to fear that you're going to die from it, or taking it appropriately, that is another part of it. The fact that you're going to drink a Coca-Cola and not mildly get addicted to it and addicted to cocaine, Pure Food and Drug Act. The idea that you're not going to accidentally get addicted to opium for taking an elixir, Pure Food and Drug Act. All right? We're going to talk more about this as we move forward. Elimination of social injustices. The Hull House in Chicago, founded by Jane Addams. We're going to talk a little bit about that. They also fought against child labor. Populists, socialists, feminist leaders of the era. William Jennings Bryan, face of the Populist Party, and later the Democratic candidate for president in 1896. Eugene V. Debs, leader of the American Socialist Party at the turn of the century. Samuel Gompers, leader of the American Federation of Labor. Jane Addams, leader of the Hull House. Lillian Wald, anybody thinking about becoming a nurse or getting involved in medicine? She was a crusader for women to have the right to get medical education in America. She was also a major crusader for humanitarian efforts in America and globally. Margaret Sanger faced for both child labor, fighting against it, not for it, obviously, and also promoting contraception and birth control, which ultimately landed her in jail. So we'll talk a bit more about Margaret Sanger as we move forward. All right, questions up to this point? So here is the Hull House. That's Jane Addams on the left. The Hull House operated for just over 100 years. Based out of Chicago, the goal of the Hull House was to help immigrants coming into Chicago with the belief in the 3 R's of the settlement house: residence, research, reform. Here are the services that were provided: child care, domestic violence prevention, economic development, family services, job training, literacy, care for the elderly. What does this sound like in today's speak? What type of services? Okay, we would call these social services, right? That's part of it. No, that is a social service. All right, how am I doing over here?
13 minutes.
Beautiful. The muckrakers. These are your investigative journalists, and in some cases cartoonists, that are going to rake the muck. Has anyone in here ever worked in a barn, a stable, or a chicken coop before? Hey, what do you have to do in that job? You got to shovel manure. You know what I'm saying? You got to rake the muck. That's what they're doing. Teddy Roosevelt gave them that name. All right? So, what are they raking up? They're trying to expose wrongdoing in business, government, and society. I am merely scratching the surface on the muckrakers here. There are so many, but I'm highlighting a few. Jacob Riis, author of How the Other Half Lives, he exposed the problem of tenements and slums in New York. He will inspire Louis Hine. We've all seen pictures of child labor, yes? There's a decent chance that if you've seen a picture of child labor, Louis Hine was responsible for it. Theodore Dreiser, author of Sister Carrie, The Financier, The Titan, and An American Tragedy, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1930. Tremendously important muckraker. Upton Sinclair, arguably the most famous muckraker of the era, author of The Jungle. Have you heard of this book? It is considered one of the most important books of the 20th century. Here's the premise. A family from Lithuania immigrates to America to achieve the American dream. They are absolutely, as soon as they arrive, going down this horrible downward spiral, okay, at every turn. Much of the book is based around the corrupt meatpacking industry of Chicago. However, that is not the intent of the book. The intent of the book is for the reader to have empathy for the plight of the American immigrant. But, as Upton Sinclair said, I aimed for the public's heart, and by accident, I hit them in the stomach. Because the thing that everybody really cared about was how nasty the meatpacking industry was, which led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the passage of the Meat Inspection Act. That didn't change the fact that immigrant groups were still being marginalized and exploited for cheap labor. That's where Sinclair was, that's what he was going for. Very powerful book, highly worth your time to read. Would you agree? Awesome. Ida Tarbell, author of The History of the Standard Oil Company to expose Rockefeller. Henry D. Lloyd also wrote a book to expose Rockefeller and Standard Oil. His book, Wealth Against Commonwealth. Lincoln Stevens wrote The Shame of the Cities, which was printed in McClure's to expose corrupt political machines in places like New York and Chicago. Have you guys heard of Nellie Bly before? Tremendously important lady who went undercover into the Bellevue Asylum in Blackwell's Island in New York to expose the horrible treatment of the mentally ill at the turn of the century. New magazines are exposing all of these stories for the muckrakers. Cosmopolitan, Collier's, McClure's, everybody's, Puck, The Judge. Even though Puck and The Judge were satirical magazines, they did the lion's share of publishing the most famous political cartoons of the era, which, you know, people like Thomas Nast, Joseph Kepler, and Frank Beard, they were all considered muckrakers in the era. So on the left, we have The Jungle, and on the right, we have Upton Sinclair. Really horrible chapter in American history and in Virginia history. Yep. See you, bud. See you later. Yep. You too. Eugenics in Virginia. I don't know if you're familiar with what was and what is eugenics, but this is the belief in the possibility of improving the qualities of human population by discouraging reproduction by individuals presumed by society as undesirable. This was a horrible problem because the majority of the people that were being placed in asylums and being either sterilized or in some cases castrated, that was being done against their consent, and in some cases they had no knowledge of it. Very famous Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell. Carrie Buck learned that she had been sterilized without her consent. She takes this to the Supreme Court, and guess what? The court rules against her. It's pretty insane. And years later, her sister Doris finds out she had been sterilized. Well, after the Buck v. Bell decision, 30 other states passed laws similar to Virginia for eugenics. To make this even more disturbing, in the Nuremberg trials, after World War II, where the Nazis were put on trial, when eugenics came up, they cited Buck v. Bell as precedent. Pretty intense, pretty crazy. So very, very sad chapter in both Virginia and U.S. history. All right, progressive political gains in local governments in urban areas. Urban areas are getting bigger, meaning you've got more government officials that are going to be elected, and you have the creation of new commissions. So local commissioners, councils, council managers, school boards. So give me an example, guys. We elect a school board, right? What else do we elect in our community? A board of supervisors. Very good. That was a good guess. A board of supervisors. We elect a commissioner of revenue. We elect a treasurer. Okay? That's when all this kind of thing starts. Do we have a mayor?
Yeah.
We don't have a mayor. Does Richmond City have a mayor? They do. Do we have a city council? We don't. Does Richmond? They do. We have a board of supervisors. It just depends on where you are, right? It varies from locality. So progressives are largely middle class. They're kind of stuck between two groups, tycoons and the large wave of immigrants coming in for cheap labor. They're going to appeal to the state governments for changes like the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. Initiative is proposing the law. Referendum is voting on the law. Recall is removing a governmental official. Like in your lifetime, a very famous thing that has changed is the legalization of what? And I'm not trying to be funny here. Marijuana. Thank you. Excellent. Many states that went through that process put it up via initiative and referendum. Okay? That has stuck around at the state level. They exposed graft, misappropriation of funds, bribery, and corruption in government. They wanted to improve elections, especially after the whole Boss Tweed thing we learned about last lesson. They also want the direct election of U.S. senators to curb corruption. Secret ballot was passed through the initiative and referendum in the U.S. in 1892. 1913, the 17th Amendment was passed, the direct election of U.S. senators, which we still elect our U.S. senators today. And primary elections became normalized in the early 1900s, which means a particular party runs numerous candidates to receive the nomination from their party. Does that make sense? Are we good? Questions? Okay. Bum-ba-da-ba. This is where I stop. It is Women's History Month. Huzzah. This is a good time to talk about, this is a good topic to talk about during Women's History Month, progressive women. Bless you. Women were an indispensable catalyst in the progressive era. They're focused on labor rights. They're focused on temperance, banning alcohol. Not all, but many were. And they're focused on voting rights. Women fought for major improvements in the fight against poor treatment in the labor force, to bring an end to child labor. Remember, the Children's Bureau was established in 1912 under President William Howard Taft to establish child labor laws and to hire lawyers to defend children in court. Margaret Sanger, birth control lady, she was a big part of that movement. Getting children lawyers, like there's a little girl who got her hair caught in a machine in New York and her entire scalp was ripped off. And they wanted to just fire her because she broke the rules. Sanger fought for her to get a lawyer and a defense team so she would not only receive health care, but compensation for the accident. Major victories in terms of safety and workplace improvements for safety as a result of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire in New York City. 146 workers died, many of which were women. It also led to the establishment of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Really important landmark Supreme Court case, guys. Mueller v. Oregon. The attorney that defended the women in this case was Louis Brandeis. This was a court case that fought for constitutional protection of women's rights in the workforce, health care for women, as well as an 8-hour workday. In 1908, Brandeis goes on to serve as our first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court in 1916. Alcohol came under attack during this era, but remember that wasn't new. Remember the first temperance movement had occurred prior to the Civil War. They just picked back up where they left off. You have the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded by Frances E. Willard, and the Anti-Saloon League. They're going to come together to push for the 18th Amendment, the prohibition of alcohol. Am I good?
30 seconds.
Beautiful. We're actually going to talk more about the 18th Amendment when we get into the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, because that's where most of that was happening. It'll later be repealed in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. Here are some of your crusaders. Carrie Chapman Catt, Helen Keller. Yes, the Helen Keller was a suffragette. I don't know if you all realize that. Anybody know that already? Sweet. Alice Paul, tremendously important person in the era. Thank you, sir. Jeanette Rankin, first woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Montana. Scores of other brave suffragettes picked up the torch. And in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson. So these are our ladies crusading for the right to vote. Questions for me? Comments, concerns? Everybody good?